Well, going back to the professed values, among them is that, prominent among them, is that public opinion should determine policy and hence rule the world. And it's worth taking a closer look at this doctrine. In the modern period, the issues came to the fore primarily in the more free societies, first England, then the United States. They were raised by David Hume in his discussion of the first principles of government. And his words, as usual, are lucid and compelling. I'll simply quote them. Hume found nothing more surprising than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is brought about, we shall find that as force is always on the side of the governed, the governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments, as well as to the most free and the most popular. Well, Hume was an astute observer, and his paradox of government is much to the point, although history teaches us all too painfully that we cannot ignore the contrary thesis which had been put forth somewhat earlier during the English Civil War, the thesis that the power of the sword is and ever has been the foundation of all titles to government. Force, of course, has more subtle modes, including an array of costs well short of overt violence that attach to the refusal to submit. Hume's concept of supportive opinion can be elaborated, as in Gramscian concepts of hegemony and others. But the basic point, I think, is correct. Public consent and implicit submission can take many forms, among them the form recognized by the British Foreign Office in 1945. Like it or not, this is what you're going to get. A more polite way of putting the matter had been devised by American sociologist Franklin Henry Giddings when U.S. forces landed in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century with the goal of, as the president put it, to uplift and civilize our little brown brothers. In fact, uplifting several 100,000 of them directly to heaven and leaving wreckage that in many ways remains and is right now, in fact, eliciting quite a remarkable reaction over a century later, as you can read in the front pages. Well, to explain the civilizing mission in proper tones, Giddings devised the concept consent without consent. Here's the way he put it. If in later years the colonized will see and admit that the disputed relation was for the higher interest, it may reasonably be held that authority has been imposed with the consent of the governed, rather as when a parent prevents a child from running into the busy street and the child later comes to recognize that it was the right thing to do. This concept, consent without consent, has been of considerable utility for structures of dominance, not only in imperial history, but with all the possible elaborations, the essential core remains pretty straightforward, much as Hume formulated it. And the conundrum is real. Even despotic rule is commonly founded on a measure of consent. It was true for the Nazis, for example. The abdication of rights is familiar in more free societies, and yet popular opinion is not a force easily discounted, particularly when it's organized and mobilized. An elite opinion, particularly in the more democratic societies, has always recognized it to be a serious threat, particularly at moments when it proves effective and has to be repressed and controlled in the service of the higher interests of power and wealth, which are supposed to rule the world by right. These issues arise regularly at moments of disruption and crisis. One case of very great historical significance was the formation of the independent United States 250 years ago, with, of course, a new constitution. And Hume's conundrum arose at once. It was formulated sharply by James Madison, leading framer of the Constitution. England was, of course, the model that the framers considered. And Madison pointed out, I'm quoting him, that if in England elections were open to all classes of people, the landless majority would institute an agrarian law which would distribute property, and that, of course, would be unjust. The rights of property owners must be protected, and more generally, as Madison put it, a just government must protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, a basic principle that rules the world. Madison recognized that over time there was likely to be an increase, quoting him, an increase in the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life and secretly sigh for a more equal distribution of its blessings, and their leveling spirit may lead to efforts at reform which will threaten property rights. The popular ferment of the time, Madison felt, already gave warning of the future danger. And to ward off such injustice, the Madisonian Constitution, the one we have in the United States, assigned primary power to the Senate, which at that time was unelected, and which represented, as Madison put it, the wealth of the nation, those who have sympathy for property owners and their rights. The rest would then be fragmented in various ways, and he hoped that by such means the great majority would be marginalized and controlled so that power would remain in the hands of the privileged few by consent without consent and for the benefit of all. It's important to remember that Madison's mentality was pre-capitalist. He assumed that those who held the wealth of the nation would be benevolent gentlemen, aristocrats of the mythical Roman model, dedicated to the public good. Adam Smith, at exactly the same time, had a much sharper eye. He wrote, 1776, that those he called the masters of mankind, and for him the merchants and manufacturers of England, would follow their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. Did not take too long for Madison to recognize his error. Writing to Jefferson in 1792, he deplored the daring depravity of the times as stock jobbers become the Praetorian brand of government, at once its tools and its tyrants, bribed by its largesses, overawing it by clamors and combinations, which is not a bad description of today's neoliberal world 225 years later. It's of some interest to compare Madison's concerns with those of Aristotle in the first major work of political science, his Politics. Aristotle reviewed a variety of political systems. He concluded that democracy was the best, or perhaps the least bad, but he recognized a flaw. The great mass of the poor could use their voting power to take the property of the rich, which would be unjust. Madison and Aristotle faced the same problem, but they selected opposite solutions. Aristotle advised reducing inequality by what we would call welfare state measures. Madison felt that the answer was to reduce democracy, setting the stage for popular struggles, elite repression that continue until the present day. Such conflicts arise regularly when social life is disrupted, maybe by depression or by war. So during World War I, the United States was only peripherally engaged, but nevertheless the war was followed by a severe repression. Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, the harshest repression in modern U.S. history. Thousands of people were deported, many were jailed. The vigorous labor movement was smashed, along with independent thought. It paved the way for the Gilded Age that followed through the 1920s until it collapsed with the Great Depression. Well, despite the short-term efficacy of force, the masters of mankind understood that enough freedom had been won by popular struggle so that state violence was becoming inadequate to control the masses, and it would be necessary to impose what Hume called implicit submission in other ways, by control of attitudes and opinion. Recognition of this new reality was expressed in both intellectual opinion and in institutional form. In intellectual opinion, the recognition was articulated in essays of the 1920s on democratic theory, most notably by Walter Lippmann, the most respected and influential U.S. public intellectual of the 20th century. In its institutional counterpart, the recognition was expressed in the rise of the huge public relations industry, initially and most expansively in the more free societies, the United States and Britain, where it was needed most to ensure that the public will, in Hume's phrase, resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. The enormous public relations industry was devoted to what Lippmann approvingly called a new art in the practice of democracy, the manufacture of consent, the engineering of consent, in the phrase of his associate Edward Bernays, who was one of the founders of the public relations industry. It's worth remembering that Lippmann and Bernays were at the social democratic edge of the political spectrum, the kind of left end. They were Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals, in the U.S. sense of the term liberal, meaning social democratic. Both of them had been members of the first state propaganda agency, Wilson's Committee on Public Information, the Orwellian name, created to drive a pacifist population to jingoist fanaticism and hatred of all things German. And it succeeded brilliantly, very much impressing the members of the commission, like Lippmann and Bernays, who hoped that the same techniques would ensure that what they called the intelligent minorities would rule undisturbed by the trampling and the roar of a bewildered herd, the general public, ignorant and meddlesome outsiders whose function is to be spectators, not participants. It's a central theme of Lippmann's so-called progressive essays on democracy, from which I'm taking these quotes. And in the same vein, one of the founders of modern political science, Harold Lasswell, another eminent progressive figure, urged that we not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not. We are the responsible men. And the thinking captures very well the perceptions of progressive intellectual opinion. So President Wilson, for example, held that an elite of gentlemen with elevated ideals must be empowered to preserve stability and righteousness. It's essentially the perspective of the founders of American democracy. In more recent years, the elite of gentlemen are transmuted into what's called the technocratic elite, the action intellectuals of Kennedy's Camelot, Straussian neocons, other configurations. But throughout, one or another variant of the doctrine prevails with its rather striking Leninist overtones. As I mentioned, the threat of democracy regularly arises when social life is disrupted by economic crisis or war. The Great Depression and World War II led to a powerful wave of radical democracy all over the world, with interesting consequences that there's no time to go into. But within the United States, the reaction was similar to Wilson's Red Scare after World War I, the anti-communist crusade, which is mislabeled McCarthyism. Actually, McCarthy carried it to an extreme, and he was tolerated as long as he kept to the right targets, but he was eliminated very quickly when he made the mistake of attacking systems of authentic power. The tumult of the 1960s, much of it inspired by the Indochina Wars, raised similar elite concerns, and we're living now in the aftermath. Once again, the most revealing reactions are at the left end of mainstream spectrum. They were clearly articulated in an important study entitled The Crisis of Democracy. It was written by liberal internationalists from Europe, the United States, and Japan. Within the United States, it's the group that staffed the Carter administration, gives an indication of their political stance. The crisis that they perceived mirrored the traditional concern that there's too much democracy. The American rapporteur, Harvard professor, government advisor, Samuel Huntington, looked back with nostalgia to the days when, as he put it, Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, so that democracy flourished with no crisis. The public was silent, passive, apathetic, obedient, willing to be spectators, not participants, leaving serious matters to the intelligent minority, to adopt the Lippmann-Bernays terminology. But in the 1960s, a threat to order began to arise. Special interest groups tried to enter the political arena and press for their demands. The special interests were women, minorities, young people, old people, farmers, workers, in short, the population, who began to forsake the function of passive spectators assigned to them in progressive democratic theory. There was one group that was omitted in the lament of the liberal internationalists, the corporate sector. They do not comprise a special interest. they represent the national interest, and therefore their dominant influence in what we call democracy is right and proper and merits no mention or concern. One leading concern of the Trilateral scholars was the failure of the institutions responsible for what they called the indoctrination of the young, the schools and the universities. They were not indoctrinating the young properly. And that's why we see these uprisings in the streets and the efforts of the special interests to press their demands in the political arena. And the Trilateral scholars therefore urged more moderation in democracy, their phrase, if the national interest is to be protected, along with more effective indoctrination of the youth. It's of some interest to look at the right-wing counterpart to the liberal internationalist call for more moderation in democracy. Intellectually, it's much less interesting, but it's of course much more influential with direct ties to systems of power. Its most eloquent expression was in a memorandum by corporate lawyer Lewis Powell, soon to be appointed to the Supreme Court. It was a memorandum that was sent secretly to the business-based American Chamber of Commerce, soon leaked. Its title is "The Attack on the American Free Enterprise System." It's interesting not only for the content, but for the paranoid tone. You might want to look it up on the internet. It's interesting reading. For those who take for granted their right to rule, if anything gets out of control, it means that the world is coming to an end, rather like a spoiled 3-year-old child. So the rhetoric tends to be inflated and paranoid. Powell identifies the criminals who are destroying the American free enterprise system. Ralph Nader, with his consumer safety campaigns. Herbert Marcuse, who was preaching Marxism to the young new leftists who were on the rampage all over, while what he calls their naive victims dominated the universities and the schools, controlled television and other media, the educated community, virtually the entire government. And their takeover of the country, he said, is a dire threat to freedom. Powell drew the obvious conclusion. Business owns the country, and therefore the oppressed business people who have lost all influence to this rampage should organize and defend themselves instead of idly sitting by while fundamental freedoms are destroyed by the Marxist onslaught from the media, the universities, and the government. And despite the absurdity of the picture, it shouldn't be simply dismissed with ridicule. This is the mentality of the masters of mankind, who can act and do act. And as after World War I, the ideological constructions of the intellectual classes had their institutional counterpart. In this case, the neoliberal programs that began to take shape by the late 1970s, accelerated under Reagan and Thatcher, then beyond, right to the present. Among their other effects, all of these programs undermine functioning democracy, including the collapse of the center and the extreme contempt for institutions, which can take ominous forms. I'm old enough to remember the emotional impact of Hitler's speeches, which I heard on the radio as a child, not understanding the words, so the mood that they evoked was clear enough.